situation right now.
Hello, my name is Bob Bowman, and I'm presenting a talk on the history of Carlisle and Chautauqua on September the 21st, 2023 at the Carlisle Lions Club for the Carlisle Area Historical Society. On my first slide, I will make an introduction and what we're going to cover. Here we go.
You know, the good news is this is being recorded. There's some editing. You can watch it at home at your leisure. There you go. TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, whatever. Because you will not find history of Carlisle anywhere on the internet. Not Carlisle, Ohio. It does not exist. I know, I've been looking off and on. Yay! Now you must hear everything. Because even the dead can hear me now. Okay, I'll try not to speak too loud. Save my voice. All right, let me reiterate again. This is the Carlisle and Franklin Township map that I downloaded yesterday. And you'll see in the red circle, Carlisle. That blue X is where we're sitting approximately right now. And we're talking about the story of Carlisle, what it looks like today. Number one is where I grew up. The first 20 years of my life in my parents' house on Farmington Road in Miami Township, the very end of Carlisle School District. Number two is where I lived with my wife Judy and have lived for 15 years after about 30 years in Southern California. And so why we're back here rather than being in Southern California is a different story. Okay, next slide, please. Should go down. Christy. Okay, this is the earliest map I could ever find that shows Carlisle Station. It's a map of Warren County from 1855. It's called Carlisle Station. It's called the railroad. The first railroad that came through here was the Cincinnati, Hamilton, Dayton Railroad. And one of the people in charge was George Carlisle. He bought some land, donated a little piece of it, which is now the town hall up there, provided a local citizen would name the station Carlisle Station. Before that, it was called the Jersey Settlement, which I'll explain in a couple of minutes. And that's where Carlisle came from, and that's where it is, relative to the Great Miami River. Now it's expanded, but that's where the heart of Carlisle is. And it's basically right up here on the railroad tracks. Okay, next slide. And of course, next door is the Carlisle Area Historical Society, which was incorporated 40 years ago. I was going to list some of the charter members, but I didn't get around to them. They're in the book of Carlisle history, so you can read about that. And so, and about the mural and so forth. So you can visit there and see all the other things. But that's next door to where we are now. Next slide, please. We're going back to early history. Who was living in Carlisle a long time ago? This is from the ancient Ohio, and you see time periods. And it goes back 10,000 years up to modern time. And BP means before present, i.e. now. So about 2,000 years ago, there were what we call Eastern Woodland people, and they built the Carlisle Fort, which I didn't know about, but are now there. So that's the first permanent people we know of that lived in the Carlisle area over 1,500 years ago. Next slide. And they were part of the Hopewell culture. And this is a map of the Hopewell. They were an affiliated group, cultural people that lived for about, as a culture, about 400 years, from about 0 AD up to about 500 AD. And you see there's the Ohio culture in orange. So these are the people that built Serpent Mountain and many others. And one of their settlements was here in the Twin Creek Valley and on the earthworks above it. Next slide. And this is the Hopewell culture, and it flourished and the architectural style, and they had a very complex ceremonial life. And these are the earthworks. they were discovered in 1844 by a guy, and they were documented in the book. They're badly eroded, but this, they stretched it out. And about 20 years ago, they became a park, the Twin Creek State Park. And so there's actually walking trails and a little, pretty well eroded. Next slide. This is a map, an aerial map showing what's left of the earthworks. The circular, there's some complex center in the middle. There are articles. I wrote one for Franklin History Society a couple of years, give a little more detail, and there are references to if you really know more. But they were there. But you can see that they were there. Next slide. This is that metro part. It points out kind of where it is. It's right off Chamberlain Road. You go up to Boomershine Hill, which I'm pretty sure all residents know what Boomershine Hill is, and you go off to the right, and that's where the park is. You can walk back in the woods, and there's a lot of hiking trails too. You don't see very much. Next slide. This is the largest marker that points it out. Gives a little summary of the culture. No one really knows very much about the people. They had no written form, no records of any kind, no people that could ever communicate with them. So everything is extracted from remnants of bone. They did fancy stone that if you go to Mound City and Chautauqua and others, it's examples of work. So everything is pretty much a guess. Occasionally there's some DNA, but these people were kind of displaced by the other. Next slide. And so the question is, why did they leave? Well, they left around 500 AD. There were other people that came in, and it was a combination of reasons. There was conquest, there was a mini ice age, there were all kinds of things that changed people. And then by the 1600s, the Europeans, the Spanish, they came up and pushed the people from the south. The European French came down from the south. Z's came, lots of Indians. So they pretty much vacated. So that by 1700, there was almost nobody in this part of Ohio, Miami Valley, or Kentucky. Next slide. And so in the 1700s, the first real explorers went down here looking, for furs and gold, whatever else they didn't find. But they came to Ohio, and what they found were tribes that had migrated into this vacant area and set up homes. And so that's what who came in. Of course, they were hundreds of years after people lived there, no time. So they didn't know anything about the earlier culture anyway. So that what was in Ohio. Next slide. Now, when the end of the 1700s, was the American Revolution, and so before that, there were tribes, there were that lived there, and if you can see, there are red dots. Those are the main routes, trade routes, so forth, that the natives used between Lake Erie, Ohio River, and further. But when I blow up, you can see the map on the right. In the area where Carlisle area, it's far away from either map. It was on nobody's main route. There were no known villages, there were no. So this was just woodland, forest, virtually uninhabited. And so when the first settlers came here in the 1790s, the land wasn't really contested. There weren't native tribes like there were in other parts of Ohio that wanted it property. So, but there were Indian wars. You probably know of the St. Clair's defeat and the other war that took place. And Anthony Wayne at the Treaty of Greenville had, Tippecanoe battle up there and forced the Indians to move to the northern part. So the map on the right shows a red line across it. That was Indian territory. After the Greenville Treaty, that was the Indian land. Everything to the south was open for settlement. And that's when the first speculators came and came Cincinnati and Marietta, and then speculators into Dayton and so forth. And of course, the Great Miami River was a route up. It wasn't a very efficient river, but it was a way up. So that's where the first settler came. Next slide. So when the Franklin Township was formed, it was after 1800. Warren County was actually formed when the state of Ohio was formed in 1803. And Franklin Township was part of that. And there were a group of families, Barcalows and Maxwell and Skank and Boyd, on over many of these others, were these early families, frontier people who came in, got chunks of land. And they got these tracts of land, they settled them, and the east side of Franklin was an area that was mostly populated, and that would go back to 1796, when Skank and Cooper laid out the first village now, which was Franklin, 1796. And so that was the eastern side, and on that settlement, on the western side, the Barlow brothers came in 1804, and they got the land, all the land between Twin Creek and the west bank of the Miami River up to about where Chautauqua is. That was their land, and so that was the area that would become Carlisle Friendship Township. Next, please. Okay, so in 1804 and 1805, the first real settlement, the Vanderveers, you've heard of those, and from New Jersey, among many others. There was a group of them. They came, they brought the first cargo and so forth. And so they were still out, they would raise crops, mostly wheat and corn, but they would take the water, the crop down river, down the Great Miami in the spring, down the Ohio River, down to the markets in New Orleans. And then they would basically walk back. Well, it wasn't very efficient, but in 1815, Franklin built a bridge, a covered bridge, down there. Now opened up roads into what is the Carlisle area, the western township. And the land's nice and flat here, very productive. And so, then they built a larger bridge. It was a toll bridge, but again, they could bring products over there. And then in 1825, the Miami Area Canal went through Franklin. Now you've had ways to ship larger quantities of goods and products downstream or upstream, because the canal runs, you can go up both directions. Okay, next slide. But things changed dramatically in the 1850s when a train like that one came through. Didn't ask for it. I'm not going to try out property.
That's great special effects there, Bob. That's pretty cool.
Hey, it cost me an extra to do that. This is not a very good image, but this is George Carlisle. And he was out of Cincinnati, and he was of the Cincinnati-Hamilton-Dayton Railroad. The first railroad in this area that went from Cincinnati, Hamilton-Dayton on the west bank of the Great Miami River. So it didn't go through Franklin, through Carlisle, down the west side of the town, down Hamilton, Cincinnati. But the land was easier to do. On the east side was already the Miami Area Canal. And so they built a station here, and this was a switching station. And that's what the Mount Grocery, that's literally across from Railroad Street, which is Park Avenue. And all that land over there was the railroad, which later became the B&O, and later became speed. Well, they would build storehouses, and the new cash crop in here was tobacco. So, as probably most of you know who live around here, for more than a century, tobacco was the cash crop. There was still corn, there was still wheat, and stuff, but you made a lot. But it's very intensive work. I've never done it. My mother did when she was a little girl, and she said it was very tough. I'm sure many of you have family. Maybe a few of you actually have to work in tobacco fields, but it's tough. She told me she didn't like picking up those big tobacco worms off her when she was 6 or 7 to pick that stuff up. So anyway, but they was, and they were well-to-do farmers. They built a number of big houses. You can see like what's the Kroll Mansion and others here in Carlisle were built by the farmers. The Vanderveers did some. Chamberlain did it. That Chamberlain family, Charlie, they had several brothers and a bunch of property. They came in about 1810, 1812, something like that. And they had big chunks of land. So, next slide. Now, the railroad continued. Now, in 1874, another railroad was started west side, was going to go to Mackinac. Michigan. It really went to Jackson, Michigan. It came down and ended in Franklin. There it joined what was the New York Central. It came through Carlisle, so they had crossed railroad tracks through here, and this was a junction. So, and this is on the chassis. This is that road right there. And so, you know, they changed names over the decades and consolidated. But that was posted in 2016 with carrying stuff with the caboose, you know, and of course the painting on the mural on the side of the historical building points that out. I could give you a lot more, but I was told to be short and now. So, next slide. I want to go a little more in depth into what I consider and the great Republican rally on October the 3rd, 1868, when Edwin Stanton was the featured speaker. He was the Secretary of War for President Lincoln, who had been assassinated in '65. He was the prime non-presidential candidate, spokesman for the Republican Party. And he was the one that basically ran the War Department and the strategy of the Civil War. And that Carlisle, and the person that they were running with was Warren Franklin named Robert Skank. And he was elected to Congress as a Whig. He later ran as a Democrat for one term, and when the Republican Party formed, he became a Republican. So he was a very versatile politician. But at the beginning of World War II, he was appointed a brigadier general because he had lots of political connections. That's how you made general in the time of the Civil War. You were politically connected, so they made you a general. He didn't. But he got wounded at the Second Battle of Bull Run and was promoted to a major general. However, he actually was wounded sufficiently that he never moved back to combat, but he was re-elected as a Republican in 1864 and 1866. Well, you know, there was a scandal with Johnson and all these things. So 1868 was a very contested election. So the Republican out of the congressional district here held a big rally. And Carlisle was chosen because it's on the major railroad of the four counties that form the district. In the center, we reach from Dayton and Cincinnati easily, the other route, and the roads would lead here. So it was arranged that they would meet here at a big rally. Next slide. And there's that map to show where it is. So the CHM Railroad Depot is the upper red circle. That's where the train dropped the delegation to a crowd of cheers from the buildings around there. Then they had a parade down to this rally point. This was a park on the west side of Franklin. It had been used as a rally for things kind of like farmland, but for a number of years, and would later become known as the first site of Chautauqua. And on the far right, you see this little red circle just above the line by the Mountain Lions Bridge, and that's where Skank has been born. The Skank family owned a lot of property, were well connected in the community, and so they held the rally there. And next slide. These are the announcements that were posted the day after the rally. You're not supposed to read them. I have them. But basically, they said, God walked on earth here when the Republicans were there. I mean, it was really wonderful number of crowds, stirring speeches. Everything was good. Next slide. And if you summarize what was said in the Republican papers the Republican papers said there were 20,000 to 60,000 people that came to Carlisle to that park for that event. The one anti-Republican paper said, well, maybe there were 2,000 or 3,000. But that, the paper said. And so, if you look at the census, you go back to the data and say, well, I mean, if you look at the population for the four counties that made up the congressional district, and you count every man, woman, and child, you have 25% of the population. Furthermore, in 1868, only men could vote, men over 21. Women had no right, and that suffrage thing was almost 50 years away, right? So, and so the average population would probably be about 145,000. So if they had 60,000 people there, that meant that with 40% of the population, or roughly 165% of the voters showed up. Anyway, If you had 10,000, you would still have 25% of the voters. You know, it could have been a big number. So, getting newspapers for accurate reporting of what happened is not a good idea. It wasn't 1860s and not 2023 either. So. Okay, or the video news. You know, that's our newspaper. Next slide. The consequence was that when the election was held, on about a week later, but it was October 13th, Skank won by 50.7% of the vote over Bellingham. If you may know the history, Bellingham was a very controversial anti-war enemy of Lincoln, had been exiled to Canada and lots of other things. And Bellingham had been elected earlier to Congress. Skank won by 473 votes in the total votes cast. But he was re-elected to Congress, and it is assumed that this rally gave support and kind of pushed him over the edge. So it was a historic event. As far as I know, the largest documented event. Bigger than any sporting event we ever heard of, right? Even when Carlisle won county championships and stuff. I don't think they had anything like that. Anyway, so it was kind of an important event. Next. And this is map. That's where the Grove was actually held. And it was in the flood. The green line is where the levee was built around Franklin after the flood. So it's outside the flood plain, in that kind of open area. But it was a large area that would support a large gathering of people. Next slide. The reason we know about that is Charlie Chamberlain over here read a book. I didn't know he read more than one book. He read this book by Walter Starr. And Starr had mentioned that there was this big rally in Carlisle, Ohio. And we'd never heard about that. Now, Charlie and Bruce go back. He had family who was living in Carlisle at that time period. Great-grandfather or great-grandparents were living here. Yeah, all were living right here at that time. And, you know, he saw this, and so Charlie asked me, he said, you know, at that time I was on the board of Carlisle Historical Society and just been president of Franklin Historical Society. I had, you know, been following up. I never heard that either. So we started investigating the two of them. And next. So we know there were a lot of people, and he said, this is a story that somebody ought to know about now. It's almost 150 years ago, and it was not in any of the books. You find any of the references, any of the papers, any of the journals of modern, the last 100 years. There's not a single reference to this event of local history at all. And so, okay, we said, it ought to be worth something. And so we went and found copies of Contemporary, and so Charlie and I wrote a two-part article that was published in the Franklin Chronicle. So it's in the Franklin Chronicle. You can read it for yourself. If you're real nice, I'll be happy to send you PDF copies of it. We tried probably would too, but I know I have PDF copies of it. And we decided, you know, this is an event. Carlisle has no historical marker. This was a historical, Carlisle ought to have a historical marker for this, and the fact that this was a major railroad. So we submitted, jumped through all the hoops you have to do through Ohio History Connection to get a marker. We wrote it up, we documented it, we sent the stuff in, and they approved it. And they also said, well, you're a winner. You need $2,500, $3,000 to get the marker. So we went to the community. Lions Club gave money. Jim Gross gave a lot of money. The local people did. We chipped in a little. And we put enough money to pay our costs. And so they went down to Marietta, placed in all the Ohio historical markers. And we had one made with words on both sides. One that describes which you can go read right out there. One's on the railroad that came through here, and the other is on this event. Next slide. That's what it says about the rally. And it got approved there, and it went up in 2019. We had a big celebration here. Some of you probably were here. Next slide. This is Walter Starr. We invited him to come, and he came on his own dime, as I recall, and gave a talk, and we at the unveiling. And so, And so it's still here. And at least if you drive by, you can see Carlisle was on the map one time for a big event. And now people know something and it happened here. If they brought it to read. Next slide. Now I'm going to change topics now. And I'm going to Chautauqua. Because we all know about Chautauqua. Those of us who live and grew up around here. But it actually had a little more deep and complicated history than what we appreciated at the time here. So Chautauqua was actually an adult education center that started in the United States in upstate New York, in Chautauqua County, up near Lake Erie, south of Buffalo. It was started by an industrialist out of Akron and a Methodist minister who said people need a place to have religious gatherings in the summer, and that's how we meet. And so they chose this kind of resort area in the woods. Out in the woods, you can do that kind of retreat. Chautauqua is from an Iroquois word that means either where the fish are taken out or jumping fish. Translating Iroquois apparently is not a trivial thing. So I don't think there are any articles or whatever. So, and the Chautauqua Institution was founded as a vacation school for Sunday school teachers. It would have, intensive Bible study, back to nature, kind of thing. So this was in the 1870s and 80s. And this movement got very much in the Protestant denominations throughout America. And one of those who picked up on it was a Methodist minister in Germantown. Next slide, I think that's what I have. Yeah. His name was E.A. Harper. He was a Methodist minister in Germantown. And he organized the first two Chautauquas in 1896 and 1897, and they were held on that west side of Franklin, where the rally had been held for the Stanton's gang in the 30 years before, and it had turned in that the people in Franklin had built a racetrack there, a fairgrounds. So they had a racetrack, trotter races. The famous horse Nightingale that many of you in Franklin, that grew up here, raced, and many others. So, for a decade it was a place. And they put a tent in here, and it came for, a couple of weeks of summer event. Next slide. And that's where it's located, literally about 4 blocks west of the Lions Bridge, one bridge had been built in 1874. And if you remember, the street that crosses Lions Bridge becomes Park Street. The next block is Lake Street, because there's a little pond, they call it a lake, a little pond out there. Those two parallel, they went to what was the park zone. And that's where they have the fairgrounds, and that's where Township and Carlisle is right up that corner there. But the nearest rail line, if you remember rail, is Carlisle. And there's no real roads in those days. And so if you got the train to Franklin, you had to take, walk and get carriages or something from there. Okay, so I think the next slide shows actually what it looks like. A fairground. This was not the thing, but it was a fairground, and that's where they held the Chautauqua for 4 years. But the movement was growing, and the people that were organizing, mostly folks in Franklin, but some in mine was urban area, said we need a more permanent location for the summer. We need to expand our program. It's very popular. So they got together and they bought a piece of land. That piece of land was the Vanderveer Farm. Across from the dam was the hydraulic dam. There's the dam, there's Chautauqua Dam. It wasn't built for irrigation. It was built to provide water to the factories, the foundries of Franklin, the Randy. But it was a backup thing. And all that land to the west was woods and so forth. And next slide. And they built an auditorium and that farm in a couple of years, and then they had to have a new auditorium and tents on the outside, and people would come for a couple of weeks. They'd have retreats and speakers come in, so it was a major activity. Remember, this is summer in Ohio with no air conditioning. Out in the country in tent sounded pretty good compared to being in your stuffy house. And there was also water. They had put the dam there, so there was more water. There was water for swimming, there was water for boating. They had a little steamship that floated up and down, the Valley Queen, the Great Rides, next slide. And to accommodate the people coming on the trolley, the main, and the railroad, and the canal, there weren't many people traveling by 1900 on the canal. And the one big road, that is Cincinnati-Dayton Road, which became US 25, for the few people that all along it, they built a footbridge across. And that footbridge went up, and it was, and then you can see the boats, people, leisure, and they would go to the next slide. And they had a little post office, they had shops, they had, the auditorium, they had all kinds of stuff. Next. And swimming, and there's the boat, Miami Queen. It's not a big boat, boat, leisure. Hey, they aren't sophisticated in 1910, I'm saying 2010. Okay, next. And a number of local people said, well, we like it out here, we're going to spend the summer. So they built summer cottages. We get kind of big for a cottage, what we think of, but they were that style, they needed space. And they were open, and they weren't winterized. They were basically meant for warm weather. So they would have those, and there were about 100 or more. And so local, well-to-do people, and in addition, there were more permanent structures besides the tents. Next. One big change was this 1913 flood. Everybody knows about. Now, the actual land of Carlisle had very little impact, even though it lies between Twin Creek and the Great Miami River. This is kind of a high spot of land. So south of it got wet, and east of it, the Great Miami got wet, and Chautauqua was on that, and west of it, Twin Creek. And this is looking south from about where the levee is now. So, and there's a tall steeple. That's the United Methodist Church steeple. And then to the left of it is the Old Baptist steeple. So that was downtown Franklin. And one of the few bridges that didn't go out, that flood, the Lions Bridge, the suspension bridge, the Lions Bridge, wasn't the new one. WP. New one, almost 100 years ago, like the WP. But that was the suspension bridge with the lions on it that stayed up. So it was a lifeline. But the railroad bridges and all the other washed out, up and down the Miami River. Next. So it doesn't show well. I tried to highlight that kind of in the middle between the railroad track, everything in there was flooded on the outside to the high part. And so between Miamisburg and Franklin, and the eastern side up to there was a hotel, up to that part was wet under some water. And so it really couldn't do much. The next slide, I think. It washed out the suspension bridge. They built a walk bridge across because the trolley was still running, and it ran for a while. They had the Chautauqua Bend 14, but they couldn't because of the money, and they reorganized. And after that, about 25 years, the program at Chautauqua amplified. It became more popular, they did more diverse things, but it was still religious based, but now it became a little more secular, more summer vacation. Next slide. And they started having speakers. One of the biggest draws was Billy Sunday, evangelist. He was the super Billy Graham of the first part of the 20th century. He was a spellbinder. And so, he gave sermons all over America, and he spoke 3 times in Chautauqua. He wasn't the only one. They had ex-presidents and others. Next slide. After 1929, they built this swimming pool. That's the swimming pool still there. Any of us who are over 60 remember being in that swimming pool more than once. And so that was the swimming pool in the area. Cold water came out of the groundwater. I don't think they ever did it, if they did. So, but again, and next to that was a skating rink. And it became more open to the public, more during the summer. And they still had events. Next slide. One thing, they had horses. And they had horse stable. As we said, the residents didn't like them, the visitors did. Horseback riding a lot of fun once we went to shovel manure. It's great to have a horse. So anyway, some of the houses there. Next slide. And that's a roller skating rink. That was a big tool. I didn't like it, I would fall down all the time. There are people that coordination and like that skate, so lots of my contemporaries went to roller skating, lots of mine. Okay, next. Those are the cabins in the 30s. So those tents were the way, the small cabins that people would rent for a week or 2 weeks. You know, they weren't very fancy, but they were camping. They would, you know, be sleeping on the ground, and you could get out. There was a river, you know, there was a swimming pool, there were activities. Next. And there were shelters built. There were 133 cottages and 50 lots that people could build. And so this was as the Depression was ending, and these became very popular for family reunions, special events, all kinds of things for decades. Next slide. Now, probably the biggest speaker of all time was Mrs. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, came in 1940. Not only did she speak there, it was covered on national radio, I believe. So it was a huge event. She walked around for a day and said nice things about it. Never came back. You know, for the one that, another big event in Chicago had never been taught. Next slide. And then in the 40s they had coffee shops. You were getting, you know, and I've had no coffee shops about 25 years later. Next. Now this is about 1940 when the streetcar was still running on the east side of the Great Miami River. That's the dam that had been built up, still providing water to the factories in northern Franklin. There were a number of paper mills, and, you know, a lot of employees, and a lot of people working in Franklin. But not only did it do that, to the north, that made a great lake. You know, an excellent place for boating and so forth. And so that made it a resort for different. Next slide. This is from the 50s. Power boats were run. I remember hearing them run, maybe younger too, but they would, on weekends, they even had some competition. The downside was all those power boats were tearing up the riverbanks, and eventually they banned them. But still, you know, for a while it was, Carlisle was a happening place in this part of Ohio, and even, you know, come on, next slide. And in 1946, they had, this is Seymour Temple. He was editor of the Franklin paper, but also one of the few surviving original organizers in Chautauqua. He wrote a 50-year summary of Chautauqua, which is a great reference. It is available online, to know about the early stuff and what they did. And so they had a 3-day celebration in September, in July, on the Chautauqua, all kinds. Next slide. There at a thing, the director is Clarence Applenizer, Sharon's father, and he was a choir director and lots of other. It was a big event. It was on radio and a bunch of other things. So, next slide. But in addition, for the kiddies, there was kiddie land, boat ride, steam ride, all this other stuff. We played. I went when I was little, my brothers were little. Okay, next slide. That's a steam engine. I think, Charlie, you got that from you. I think you were the little kid in that ride. Is that not true?
It wasn't that picture, but in one of the pictures of postcards for Chautauqua, my brother and I were in the last part of the train.
So, you know, like that, but again, that was a big to do. It cost 15 cents or a quarter. Didn't everybody get to ride a train back then? Next slide. But still, there were very strong religious. There were religious camps. There were, you know, overnight church conferences, retreats, Sunday school. But there were no more of the multi-day rallies, things that were Chautauqua was known for in the beginning. But it was still very active. But there were getting the issues about when people would come, it was getting out of fashion. There were amusement parks, you know, King Island started coming on and other things. So Sargeville Lake was a big draw. There were other things in Dayton. Next slide. And then there was the 1959 flood. It was the biggest flood in this area since the 1913 flood. And that you know, got up in the pool. I think there were some carp in the swimming pool, and some reports that there was, you know, carp are not nice fish. But anyway, and there was a lot, it wasn't a lot of damage, but it, you know, didn't help. They restored it. Next slide. And what they did is they turned that skating rink into a bowling alley. You know, in the 50s and 60s, bowling alley was very popular. Bowling leagues and so forth. So I had a friend of mine in school who was a pin setter. He lived there, and he would walk there and set pins for, you know, 20 cents an hour or whatever it was, and do that. So anyway, next. But in there, they started having more events in the 50s and 60s. They had summer theater. They had skiing competition. They actually had college prep, university had football camps. My university had college prep. You go there a week before school or something, get intensified, leave high school and become college. So they were all out in this kind of camp environment. Next slide. And then in the 60s, they started having country western shows. This is the season of 67. I was around. If I had known that these guys were singing in 67, well, somehow would have found the money to go to a few of them. These are, Bill Arnold, Jerry Marie Lewis, Hank Williams Jr., Loretta Lynn, others. These are the epitome of stars came to Chautauqua and performed for crowds. I sure as I would have known about it. I mean, I was around. And next slide. But then, in '68, the Baptist Foundation bought the whole park area and turned it into a camp. There was disgruntled guys, and they burned several of the buildings. Several got destroyed in '68 and '69. But so they were damaged, and never really rode to the swimming pool went to the church camp. So the park opened as a private park in '70. Next slide, I think it says that. So here's an example in the '70s. They actually built a new auditorium, which then got rebuilt again more recently. And the Baptists ran it for almost 40 years. Next slide. And so it's the residents that was still a separate private community. That is, it wasn't part of any other town or it was a private collective group. Commune, kind of, but not based on communism, but based on, I think, financial gain. But the only time that the gates would be open is Baker's time. I remember going there on Baker's time. That was good pickings. There were a lot of houses close together, and these people had money, or even more money. Get some good candy all back then. And so, in '87, by a vote of 64 to 33, they decided to give up being private and actually applied to Miami Township and became, and the township took over responsibility for maintenance. They just couldn't afford it. The Chautauqua Association kept two buildings, the community center and the WCT, the Women Christian Temperance Union, which was sort of where they ran things and had organizations were rented out, and Boy Scouts and those things. And it was the last private community to govern itself in Ohio. It closed in '87. Next slide. Now, Jerry Harmeyer became the manager in '77 to oversee the Baptist Park. He was to remain there for over 35 years. So it was almost 50 years that they ran it. And with the Baptist church, losing money when it closed, Jerry and his son bought it out in 2013, 10 years ago. And that was 59 buildings, 45 acres, which is the main court, basketball court. And there were still there, but they were used now as a church retreat, church conference, where they were around. So it's called Camp Chautauqua. All these were there. They're still from grant. COVID didn't do them any good, but they're still out there. That's their website. You can see they got stuff going. Next slide. That's the layout of their land and their website. You see the facilities they have. But again, those are private. They're not for public. As far as I know, residents are very not able to use them as Chautauqua residents, but they are still there. Next slide. And that's one of their big events at Camp Chautauqua. So I think we're switching over now. Topics. I think I'm done. Let's try the next one. See what happens. Oh, I must be done in blank, but I don't think we're finished. So this is not very good. These are some of the events that happened in the 19th or 20th century. I'm sorry it didn't come out very clear on that copy. I didn't type it again. But
I can see it really well here.
you can see it very well.
Yeah, it's just not true.
It's not very clear from there. So, you can see that, throughout the 20th century, there were a variety of events. Here's the post office. This is Carlisle. We're back to Carlisle. So talk with, Carlisle is one of the smallest post offices in Ohio, very small. They got a picture of that. And the train came, more train service, they changed. And in '58, they incorporated. It actually became a village, an incorporated village with the mayor and an election and all the other stuff. And then, you know, they expanded, business came in. Of course, in the 50s, Carlisle became a bed. There was housing developments all over this former farmland because there were factories, Armco and the other in Middletown, Monsanto Mountain Laboratory and Imersburg had over 1,000, a lot of people lived in there. And of course, all the GM plants, Frigidaire, all of those lived there. And then paper mills and other. So this was a nice area. Carlisle was a nice area. Bedrooms, little houses, bigger, and they're still building, or have been, you know, well, they're bigger now than they used to be. Older houses transformed, these other really big. But anyway, next slide. And now, I'm kind of going to kind of wrap up. I know we're going to move on. Next slide. So, this is what Carlisle looks like in a map, Google map today. I mean, literally, I downloaded that today. And what it shows
It's
is...
not rendering very well. I can see the shade.
But it shows the city boundaries. I can't see it, but it does show the city boundaries, which is a very irregular one. Because they bump into Franklin, they bump into, you know, there were agreements made. Like, you know, because they actually go to Montgomery County, part of my, and so forth. So it's a fairly complicated city. And it became, like 2000, an actual city. You had to have 5,000 population to become an official city in Ohio. In the 2010 census, it dropped below that, like 4900. But in 2020, it came back. So now it's 5,500 people according to, so Carlisle is now a city again. Not a big city, but it is officially a city in Ohio. Okay, next. Now, maybe one of the bigger events in the last 40 years was building the new bridge, which was built in 1987. It has a name. You know, I didn't know it had a name until I started looking at it. It's the Corwin-Nixon Bridge. And there's actually a marker that says that it has a name.
It's still a new bridge.
But I mean, there are probably some people here. And so that first picture of the car I shot from the levee in Franklin showing the bridge there. And that's another picture, you know, looking across the modern bridge. And that's a first direct link into Carlisle property from the east. Everything else you had to go from Franklin, go up, or go Mimersburg down near Chautauqua, the bridge up by Hutchins Power Plant. And next slide. Now, that's Carlisle School. I had a concern a lot more about Carlisle School. They're in the books, and other people can do it. But I took that picture in April of 2019. The last photograph I had of the school building that I attended from 1st to 12th grade. So I'm a bit nostalgic. I mean, everything I know Carlisle was in the new buildings. Next slide. After we built the new school complex in 2021, at the school complex, looking at Fairview Road, all that brown spot, that was my school. And most of you, and probably all your school, went to Carlisle. That's what's left. That's not giving me warm, fuzzy feelings about Carlisle school system. Sorry, it just doesn't. Next slide. This is looking from Jamaica Road. It's a nice, big, modern, complex school with a lot of students. I've not been inside. I actually don't have much interest to go inside. I don't have any family out here. But it is a school, and it's a 21st century school. Next slide. However, Linda, in their Franklin Area Historical book, actually posted a summary of the schools here. So if you go to the Facebook page, there's a little description and pictures of the old school, going back to the one in 1874, the Central School. The first, it was only an elementary school, but it was 4 buildings, it was big, nice towers, everything was big. Everybody liked big stuff. And then the 1930 school was a full 1 to 12 school. That's where I started 1st grade. I finished up like some classes in there. So, you know, and there's a marker, and there's a church school bell in the front. Next slide. You can get these online. I know they had, just about a month ago, 6 weeks ago, a dedication of the old school bell in front of the new building with the marker, and then they put the monument, building marker, in a circle around there, sort of like a mini Stonehenge. So I think it's a nice touch. You know, it's a nice way to kind of remember the past when nothing's left. So, okay. And with that, I'm going to wrap up. I used plenty of time, and I think one last thing to show you. There are 3 books. One is the Carlisle, the Jersey settlement in West Jersey, and it was written first in 1980 and then updated in 1990 by Carlisle citizens. But Harriet Foley was the editor. She compiled and put it all together right there. Harriet did that. And the other book on the Presbyterian Church, which was the dominant church in Carlisle for 150 years. They published in 1988. Charlie's dad and his mother put together a detailed history, a very detailed history, but not only tells about Presbyterian Church, but the community, the people who live there. And so it's a great source if you have groups in Carlisle. Florida, that almost everybody from New Jersey seems to have been a Presbyterian one time or another. And then Shirley Shupert, who was a graduate in 57, she compiled in 1964 a list of all of Carlisle graduates and teachers and lots of other, in a little book. It's available, it's there. What's kind of missing, it hasn't been done since then. You know, it's been 60 years, so maybe it's a task for somebody to pick up. So I'm saying. And now, there's also 2 YouTube videos, things I didn't cover. One, a year ago on YouTube, there's a guy who took a little drive through Carlisle, and he kind of points out sites in Carlisle and things to see. So a little road trip, and we see it, but from a different perspective. And then there's another drive, the Futuro House, the YouTube spaceship out there by Mars Bowman. And so a little summary of that. So, it's a unique building. I don't know many people have actually been inside of it, but certainly look at it. It's been there close to 60 years now, I think, a long time. There's a historical overview of Miami Valley Chautauqua on YouTube. This is a talk I gave in 2016. So it's a more detailed discussion of Chautauqua, video recorded, with slides that you can use if you want to watch it. If you don't like to read anything, just watch it. And then there's another video that was made 12 years ago by the people that run Camp Chautauqua. They give a history, but that's how we know what they do. So they give a little different perspective. There's a little overlap. Mine's longer, more comprehensive. They cover things in a little more modern than what I do. And with that, I am finished. Thank you. Question if you have some.
Charlie, Bob.
Yeah.
We saw in yesterday's Daily News, and I heard on NPR too, that some official designation of Hopewell.
Yes.
Could you say?
I can elaborate on that. The Hopewell Ceremonial Centers in Ohio, which include 4 ancient, Mound City. Oh, I'm sorry. There, you hear me now? Okay. The International Monument of International Building. International World Heritage Site had approved on the 19th of September that the Ohio Hopewell Ceremonial Center is designated as a World Heritage Site. There are like 7 locations. It took a decade of applying, but it was named that. And so there'll be, those sites, Mound City, Serpent Mound, Newark, Fort Angel is the closest one. Now, there's many other cultures now. Carlisle Fort is not on that because it's small, but it is still an example. So the Hopewell culture is identified, and it puts it on the tourist map. I mean, there's no money that comes with it, but again, it puts it on the map for people who are interested in rare sites to visit.
I think they said that's only the 25th one in the
United States, and the first one in Ohio of any kind. So, it's a very nice thing. And other questions? Yes?
I've asked this on Facebook, and I've talked to my parents about it. Right across the street, there's 2 small pine trees.
Yeah.
Back in the 60s, there were 2 giant pine trees right there. And it looked like a blacktop driveway went right into the
Yeah.
middle. We were playing hide and seek or whatever on bikes when we were terrorizing Carlisle when we were kids. I rode my bike in there between those two trees. There was an unknown soldier memorial in there.
Okay,
What happened to that?
I don't know either. Somewhere in the mysteries of organization and so forth, you know, there's probably somebody in one of the American Legion of Veterans who should be the one to check on it. I honestly don't know. who's there.
Down the street.
I don't know if anybody.
What is down the street? Yeah. Bob, what is that down the street here?
Yeah, right down there. Yeah.
Where the flag
I
is?
mean, they got a new one they put up here a few years ago, right? There's been some there. But I don't know what the one you're talking about is there from before.
It was about this big square. It was
Okay.
about this high.
Yeah.
And it had a face on about 45-degree angle.
Yeah.
And it did a description a little bit. My bill, yeah.
What year was that roughly? You mean, do you remember
When
when
I did
you
it,
used something?
mid-60s.
Okay.
It was obviously, when they put that park in, they had to tear it down. So
I mean, it could have been a Civil War veteran. It could have been a war veteran, a 1898 veteran. There are people, you know, that track more of that than I do. But, you know, if you ask the chair online or stuff, and they're going to come up and answer, you ever have to put somebody special.
That's where
One place I would recommend, if you really want an answer,
I've been here since '63.
I have a suggestion. Where to look for it? There's a Germantown Museum on veteran military in Germantown, Ohio.
you're drowning me out now.
Okay. There is a Veterans Museum in Germantown, Ohio, Veterans Memorial on South Cherry Street. They're dedicated to documenting those who served in the military in the Revolutionary War. There's a group of volunteers, mostly ex-military people. I would recommend that you look them up online, look them on somewhere, call them up and go visit with your question. If you find the answer, post it.
I mean, that's something pretty significant to get lost.
But they look for that stuff more than most of us.
No. No.
Is this around?
No.
So, and again,
Okay.
but sometimes you have to do your own digging. Sometimes you have to do your own digging. You can't ask others to do it. You gotta do it yourself.
Can you,
This is like-
talk about the trans,
No, it wasn't very.
I think it was on canal.
Yeah.
But, I mean, honestly, I've had several conversations lately about that, and I really don't know anything about it.
Who are you talking about, the footbridge or the trans?
The trans Uber or trans urban,
Yeah, interurban.
interurban, yeah, because did it go to Cincinnati?
Yes. All the way to Toledo.
Okay, and it was along the river.
On the west side of the river from somewhere in Cincinnati, went to Hamilton, Middletown, Dayton, Lime, Troy, Lime. You can look it up. Email me and I'll send you something.
Okay.
I do not remember something if people ask me the word. I will not remember. You send me an email, you might get a response. Yes, sir.
But